It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. The title of my talk is Mapping Critical Theory Today. Now, mapping is a crucial yet very difficult task today. As Frederick Jameson has pointed out, one aspect of the crisis of the left, of the crisis of history more generally, lies in our difficulty to represent or to totalize the present, to make sense of the historical period we find ourselves in, of the moving scales of politics, and of the existing social forces. As military strategists know well, mapping is a condition of strategy, since no strategic thinking is possible without good maps. The strategic deadlock of the left, for example in France, where I come from, is in part a consequence of this difficulty to draw accurate maps of the battlefield and to understand the interaction of the forces that operate on it, forces of the left and forces of the right, of course. Mapping critical ideas is part of this more general attempt to draw accurate maps, political maps. One could argue that ideas have always been more important to the left than to the right. The left's goal is to break the existing consensus, to come up with new ideas that will be the foundation for new possible worlds. This is why since the first modern revolutions, the left has been in a state of permanent intellectual innovation. This is not to say, of course, that the right doesn't have ideas. Obviously, it has produced very powerful ideologies throughout modern history, neoliberalism being the last of these. But when the right finds itself in a situation of intellectual deadlock, most of the time it can fall back on the existing consensus and wait for better times. This the left can do, because the existing consensus is almost always conservative in essence. So the question is, in what state is the left today from an intellectual point of view? What are its main ideas, and in what political and social conditions are these ideas produced? This is the question I will try to address. And I will be concerned with the content of contemporary critical ideas, as well as their social and political conditions of production. In fact, what we need to understand, in my opinion, is the interaction between the two. 3 quick points before I start. First, I will be using the terms critical or radical theories to refer broadly to the ideas of the left. A more precise definition of these terms is of course required. We can come back to this problem in the discussion. The main point being that the definition of critical theories is historical. This is not a trans-historical or transcendental category, obviously. What counts as a critical theory today is not necessarily the same as in the past. For example, liberalism, or some forms of liberalism, was a critical theory in the 18th century, when absolutist regimes ruled. It is no longer a critical theory today, obviously. Secondly, what I'm referring to here is critical theories in the plural, and not critical theory in the singular and with a capital C and T. Critical theory in the singular commonly refers to the Frankfurt School, to Max Horkheimer's famous distinction between traditional and critical theory. Critical theories in the plural is a much wider and vaguer category that includes past and present members of the Frankfurt School, but also many other critical schools of thought I will be talking about. Thirdly, not so long ago, one would have referred to Marxism rather than critical theories, because Marxism was so dominant as a critical theory for a century. But it is no longer dominant, so we have to widen the categories we use and make room for non-Marxist critical theories. We are in a sense stuck with this unsatisfactory notion of critical theories until maybe new political and intellectual events allow us to clarify our categories. So what are the main aspects of critical theories today? A first aspect is that critical theories are increasingly globalized. Globalization affects trade, finance, communication, literature. It also concerns critical theories. So the first question I want to ask is, what is the nature of this globalization of critical ideas today? Now, ideas have always moved around the globe, of course. The globalization of thought in general and of critical thinking in particular is certainly not a new phenomenon. Among many others, French historian Serge Gruzinski has studied, in his great book, The Mestizo Mind, what he calls the intellectual dynamics of colonization and globalization that starts, according to him, in 15th century Latin America. This dynamics concerns critical doctrines as well. José Carlos Mariátegui, one of the founders of Latin American Marxism, is a very interesting case from that point of view. In 1928, Mariátegui published his classic book entitled 7 Essays of Interpretation of Peruvian Reality, 7 ensayos de interpretación de la realidad peruana. In this book, Mariátegui adapts a critical theory, namely Marxism, that was born in Europe in the middle of the 19th century to the Latin American context, and particularly to the Peruvian social reality. And to do this, Mariátegui was led to innovate theoretically inside of Marxism because the working class was numerically weak in Peru at the time, and that there existed a massive Indian peasantry. Mariátegui is one of the first to unite Marxism and Indianism, indigenismo, a theoretical hybrid central to contemporary Latin American progressive politics in places like Chiapas, like Ecuador, like Bolivia, for instance. So Mariátegui is a clear example of traveling critical theory, so to speak, and there are many others. We can think of C.L.R. James, for instance, of Frantz Fanon, of Tran Duc Thao, the great Vietnamese Marxist phenomenologist, and others. However, and this is the important point, starting from the last third of the 20th century, say the end of the 70s, there has been a clear acceleration of this globalization of critical theories. Since the 19th century, up until that time, critical theories were mainly elaborated in Occidental and Oriental Europe. Today, on the contrary, they are more and more disseminated across the globe. Thus, among the most read and debated critical thinkers today, we find, for example, the Peruvian Aníbal Quijano, the Slovene Slavoj Žižek, the Chinese Wang Wei, the Indian Gayatri Spivak, the Japanese Kojin Karatani, the Cameroonese Achille Mbembe, etc. This geographic diversity is clearly new in the history of critical theories. Europe remains, of course, an important center for the production of critical theories today. One can think of writers like Alain Badiou, like Tony Negri, like Jacques Rancière, like Giorgio Agamben, or Axel Honneth. But for the last 30 years or so, a profound movement has started that has led to the delocalization or decentering of critical theories in new countries. I am not saying, of course, that these countries didn't produce critical thinking until now. I am saying that on the model of Pascal Casanova's World Republic of Letters, a World Republic of critical theories is currently in the process of formation, and that theories elaborated in countries until now absent from this republic, World Republic of critical theories, are becoming increasingly visible. This globalization of critical theories is closely linked to their Americanization. Globalization and Americanization, in other words, are two interlocked aspects of critical theories. In this World Republic of critical theories I was talking about, as in globalization in general, there are hegemonic powers, and there is one in particular, the United States. Historically, the hegemonic center of gravity of critical theories has moved westward. First Eastern and Central Europe for classical Marxism, then Western Europe for so-called Occidental Marxism, and now Anglo-America. If this westward movement continues, Asia might become a new center of gravity for critical theories in the future. All the thinkers I just quoted, including the European ones, teach in US universities on a regular basis. Some have made their entire academic careers there. Others have been visiting the US more recently. Some teach at the same time in universities of other countries, for example, in universities of their countries of origin. Others only teach in the US. But in all these cases, the US academe has been a strong attractor for them. And this, of course, has important consequences in terms of the content of the critical theories they elaborate and also from the point of view of their relationship to politics. And I will come back to this in a minute. Two main reasons explain this attraction of US universities for contemporary critical thinkers. I will mention one now and the other in a minute. The first is that the US academe has a long history of integrating intellectual exiles, or refugee scholars, as Louis Koser has famously labeled them. During the Second World War, many scientists, natural scientists or social scientists, settled in the US. This is the case of members of the Frankfurt School, for example. And since then, the US academe has become a sort of global intellectual hub. So the globalization of critical theories has really two components. First, a diversification of the national origin of critical thinkers, but secondly, the Americanization of their careers. Now, this Americanization of critical theories doesn't mean that these thinkers have lost any political or intellectual specificity related to their country of origin. In this word republic of critical theories I'm talking about, national origins still matter. Two examples of what I have in mind. First, the case of Ernesto Laclau. Laclau moved to Great Britain in the 60s, and he has since then participated in Anglo-American debates about, say, post-Marxism, hegemony, the empty signifier, etc. Yet, his theories have always been influenced by his Argentinian origins, and in particular by a typically Argentinian political phenomenon, which is Peronismo, in its classical form, that of Juan Domingo Perón himself, or its contemporary form, that is Kirchnerism. One cannot understand, in my opinion, Laclau's theory of populist reason without taking this fact into account. In fact, as a young philosopher in Argentina, Laclau was a member of the local nationalist left, of a movement led by a certain Jorge Abelardo Ramos. And in the years before his death, last year, Laclau became a strong advocate of Nestor and Kirchner's policies. Second example, Gayatri Spivak. Spivak came to the US in the 1960s as well. She is the translator of Jacques Derrida's Grammatology, and she has been an important protagonist in debates about feminist theory, postcolonial theory, mainly formulating her ideas in the theoretical language of post-structuralism. Yet, in her case too, national origins matter. For instance, in her famous text, Can the Subaltern Speak?, she discusses the racial and gender dynamics involved in the practice of the sati, which is the Indian religious ritual by which widows immolate themselves with their husband, and which was banned by the British in the 19th century. So in this case too, in the case of Spivak too, national origins still matter. In sum, Americanization implies a degree of intellectual homogeneity, but this homogeneity is not total. The personal biography of critical thinkers still matters. And what also matters is the relative power of their country of origin in this world republic of critical theories. Coming from a small country with no critical tradition, with poor institutions of higher education, or no publishing houses, and a non-international language is obviously not the same as coming from the US or Europe, etc. A third aspect of critical theories is their professionalization. That is the fact that critical thinkers today are almost exclusively academics. Journalists, union leaders, party leaders, guerrilleros like the Subcomandante Marcos in Mexico produce critical theories too, of course. But in most cases, these theories are elaborated by professors, and more specifically by professors in the human sciences. In the past, one could find critical thinkers with a background in the natural sciences, like, say, Kropotkin or Pankow or Amadeo Bordiga, etc. But this seems to be less the case today for reasons that have to do with the evolution of natural sciences. For instance, Donna Haraway is originally a biologist by training, but she's, in my opinion, clearly an exception from that point of view. Now, this professionalization of critical theories has several consequences. First, it in part explains the Americanization of critical theories, and this is the second cause of Americanization I was telling you about. The fact that critical thinkers are mostly academics implies that they are subject to the sociological laws that govern the global academic field. And this field is dominated, obviously, by US universities in terms of financial means, for instance, as well as intellectual influence. So Americanization and professionalization are linked to one another in the sense that professionalization reinforces Americanization. The fact that the English language is dominant globally today also, of course, contributes to this dominance of US universities. Secondly, professionalization doesn't only concern critical theories. This is a much wider process that affects the production of knowledge in the natural and social sciences in general today. This professionalization is a consequence of increased division of labor. As Karl Marx saw, a constantly deepening division of labor is a condition for the accumulation of capital in the work process in general and the intellectual labor in particular. Critical theories, like any other kind of theory, are caught in this very process. A third consequence of this professionalization is that this is a major break with previous periods in the history of critical theories, and particularly with classical Marxism. Now, Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, or Gramsci were obviously not academics. They were political leaders and journalists. If and when they taught and wrote, which they often did, it was in party schools and journals and not in mainstream universities and academic journals. At the time, universities were in fact elitist institutions that had little to do with the mass institutions they have become since then. Of course, the fact that today's critical thinkers are mostly academics has important implications for the way their ideas are shaped, the conceptual language they use, and also, of course, for their relationship to politics. A fourth aspect of critical theories is indeed their increasingly distant relationship to real politics. This aspect is connected to the previous one, since the logic of professionalization has diverted critical thinkers from the political field. In fact, the political and the intellectual fields have become more and more separated or autonomous in the second half of the 20th century. Here it is useful to go back to Perry Anderson's understanding of the transition from classical to Occidental Marxism. According to Perry Anderson, the failure of the German Revolution in 1923 provoked a split in the history of Marxism that gave rise to the distinction between classical and Occidental Marxism. The classical Marxists, Kautsky, Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, etc., had two distinctive features. First, they were historians, economists, sociologists. That is, their writings were mostly empirical. Most of these writings, in fact, had to do with the immediate political conjuncture. Secondly, classical Marxists were organization leaders. They were political strategists confronted to real political problems. These two distinctive aspects of classical Marxists were connected to one another. It is because they were political leaders that they needed empirical knowledge about the societies they operated in. On the other hand, their leading positions in the working class movement provided them with first-hand knowledge of the social world. Now, Occidental Marxism emerges when these two features of classical Marxism start weakening. In the middle of the 1920s, working class organizations were defeated in most European countries. This historic defeat gave rise to a new relationship between Marxist intellectuals and working class organizations. The prominent Marxists of the following historical period, that is Adorno, Sartre, Althusser, De La Volpe, Marcuse, although different in many respects, have features that are exactly the opposite of the ones of classical Marxists. First, they no longer have organic ties with working class organizations, and in particular with communist parties. They certainly no longer hold positions of leadership. In cases where they were members of communist parties, as in the cases of Althusser, for instance, or Lukács or De La Volpe, they maintained very conflictive relationships with the leaderships of these parties. Furthermore, the ideas Occidental Marxists elaborate are abstract ideas. Abstraction is a central feature of Occidental Marxism, according to Perry Anderson. Whereas classical Marxists were empirical in their approach to the social world, Occidental Marxists are mostly philosophers, often specialized in epistemology or aesthetics. And as in the case of classical Marxism, the two features of Occidental Marxists are connected. The abstract language in which they write finds its origin in the fact that they are increasingly distant from working class organizations. So a sort of flight towards abstraction is typical of Occidental Marxism, according to Perry Anderson. This transition from classical to Occidental Marxism can be explained by several causes. With the emergence of Stalinism in the second half of the 1920s, an orthodox dogmatic Marxism arises, and it becomes the official doctrine of the Soviet Union and of affiliated parties in the West. This puts Marxist intellectuals in a difficult, very difficult situation. They either have to conform to this new orthodoxy or to distance themselves from working class organizations. Remaining intellectually creative most of the time leads Marxists to distancing themselves from these organizations. So how can we situate contemporary critical theories in relationship to this distinction between classical and Occidental Marxism? This separation between theory and practice that started with Occidental Marxism has clearly increased in critical theories today. It is almost never the case today that critical thinkers be members of working class organizations, and even more unlikely that they hold positions of leadership. Slavoj Žižek, for instance, was a dissident in Slovenia in the 1970s and 1980s. He even ran as a candidate for the presidential election in the year 1990. But he has no organic ties to political organizations today, and this can be said of most critical thinkers today. There are a few exceptions. French philosopher Daniel Ben Said, for instance, who was a leader of the new anti-capitalist party in France, is one of them. But this organization is very small. The new anti-capitalist party in France is very small compared to, say, the German social democracy of the beginning of the 20th century, or the Italian Communist Party of the 1960s, who both had millions of members. There is another very interesting exception to this rule, which is the case of Álvaro García Linera, the vice president of Bolivia. García Linera is the author of influential writings on the indigenous question or social movements in Bolivia, and of more theoretical writings, say, on Lenin, Negri, or Bourdieu. But he's also committed to mass politics to the point of becoming vice president of his country. So one could say that García Linera is a kind of classical Marxist in a historical age where there are very few, in fact. What about the abstraction typical of Occidental Marxism? Are contemporary critical theories abstract in the same sense? Well, they certainly are. One could argue that there is a return to metaphysical themes, even religious themes, as we will see in a minute, in critical theories today, as in the work of Alain Badiou, for instance. The critique of the subject one can find in feminist theory or postcolonial theory, or in the Ljubljana school, that is Slavoj Žižek, Mladen Dolar, Alenka Zupančić, etc., is another example of metaphysical questions widely discussed today. On the other hand, an object so central to classical Marxism as the capitalist state has received no original treatment since the classic debate between Poulantzas and Miliband in the 1970s, with the exception, in my opinion, of Leo Panitch and Sam Ginden's great book, The Making of Global Capitalism, which is, in my opinion, a major contribution to the understanding of the functioning of the American state as a global state. At the same time, there has been a return to empirical analysis starting from the 60s and 70s. Class analysis by Eric Olin Wright, for instance, the study of long waves of capitalist development by Giovanni Arrighi, or of capitalist crisis by Robert Brenner are examples of this tendency. So the flight towards abstraction I was talking about is continuing within contemporary critical theories with, however, some counter tendencies. One could argue and maybe hope that the great crisis of capitalism that started in 2008 will change the intellectual landscape and reinforce these counter-tendencies. Another very interesting aspect of critical theories is that they contain many references to religion, mainly to Christianity and Judaism, not so much to Islam, in fact. Here are a few examples. Alain Badiou wrote an important book on St. Paul, entitled St. Paul, the Foundation of Universalism. In this book, Badiou argues that St. Paul is a typical example of a subject who is constituted in fidelity to an event, a religious event in this case, but an event that can be political, scientific, or artistic. This relationship between subject and event is further elaborated in Badiou's books Being an Event and Logics of the World, where there are also references to religious doctrines, for example, to Blaise Pascal. Giorgio Agamben also wrote a book about St. Paul, entitled The Time That Is Left, which is a commentary of the Epistle to the Romans. References to Roman sacred law in Homo Sacer, for example, Christian eschatology or the Hebraic tradition are frequent in Giorgio Agamben's work. In their book Empire, Michael Hart and Tony Negri refer to St. Francis of Assisi, the so-called Poverello. Negri has also written a book about Job entitled The Labor of Job. Several of Slavoj Žižek's books refer explicitly to religious questions, for example, The Fragile Absolute, whose subtitle is Why is the Christian Legacy Worth Fighting For? Apart from Badiou, there is another Pascalian strand in contemporary critical theories in the work of Daniel Ben Saïd. Ben Saïd is the author of a book entitled Le Pari Mélancolique, The Melancholic Wager, where revolutionary commitment is presented as similar to Pascal's famous wager. Ben Saïd is also the author of a book about Joan of Arc and another about the Marranos. The Marranos are the Jews who were forced to convert in Spain and Portugal starting from the 15th century, but who continued to practice Judaism in secret. In these dark times, according to Daniel Ben Saïd, revolutionaries are a bit like Marranos. They have to secretly keep on believing in revolution. How are we to explain this presence of religious references in critical theories? Now, 2 quick points before I try to answer this question. First, this relationship between critical theories and religious doctrines is of crucial strategic importance. The way critical theories conceive of religion will have an impact on the way progressive and revolutionary movements will interact with religious movements in the future, in the Western world and elsewhere. And I am referring here to the greatest revolution of our time, that is the so-called Arab Spring. So this is a very important strategic question. Secondly, past critical theories had already made references to religious doctrines. Roland Bohr has written a great book on this topic entitled Criticism of Heaven. One can think of Ernst Bloch's study of Thomas Müntzer, published in 1921, entitled Thomas Müntzer, Theologian of Revolution, or of Lucien Goldmann's The Hidden God, a study of the tragic vision in Racine and Pascal. In fact, Lucien Goldmann compared the belief in socialism to a form of religious faith. José Carlos Mariátegui wrote an article about Joan of Arc in 1921. Walter Benjamin's project of connecting historical materialism and some aspects of Jewish messianism is also well known. However, these references to religious thought were relatively marginal in past critical theories. In the Marxist canon, that is, the main Marxist thinkers until the 1970s, religion was certainly an object of analysis. But it is one thing to study the function of religion in capitalist society, as Marx or Lenin or Gramsci have done, but quite another to be inspired by religious doctrines like Goldman and Benjamin have, or like Badiou, Negri, Zizek, and Ben Saïd today. So how can we explain this presence of religion in contemporary critical theories? The answer has 2 components, in my opinion. First, these religious references are concerned not with religion in general, but with one particular theological problem, which is the problem of belief or faith. It is the case of Pascal, St. Paul, the Marranos, and Job. The question these religious figures raise is the following: how is it possible to keep on believing, to maintain faith in God, when circumstances are hostile to belief? Why should one believe in God when the world seems so unfair or irrational? Contemporary critical thinkers have felt the need to answer a similar question, because in the 20th century, all attempts at constructing a socialist society have failed or ended in disaster. At the end of the past century, the historical record is obviously not very good for the belief in socialism. And this is why this belief, like the belief in God, needs justification against all evidence, in a sense. And this is when Pascal or St. Paul come in. Justifying belief against all evidence is what theology does best, and this is why critical thinkers are so interested in such arguments today, in my opinion. A second aspect of this question is more political or sociological. The so-called return of religion at the end of the 20th century is not only observable in critical theories, it is a much more general phenomenon. Whether the disenchantment of the world, as Max Weber would have put it, continues today, or a return of religion is taking place, is in fact a debatable question. But what seems certain is that religion has made a comeback in the political field. With currents like Islamism or evangelical fundamentalism, this new alliance of religion and politics is an important aspect of contemporary politics, of course. And this is why some critical thinkers, Terry Eagleton or Michael Lowy are examples, have taken up the challenge and tried to demonstrate that there is a progressive or even revolutionary side to religions. This is basically what Terry Eagleton has been saying in his many debates with Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins, or in the introduction to a new edition of the Gospels he recently published. This is also what Michael Lowy tries to show in his many writings about liberation theology in Latin America or on Walter Benjamin. The last aspect of contemporary critical theories I will mention is maybe the most important, or one of the most important. It is the fact that Marxism is no longer hegemonic in critical theories. Now, as a theory, Marxism is alive and well today. One could even argue that never in its history Marxism has been analytically so rich and interesting, in particular in the Anglo-American world, but not only. Authors like Robert Brenner, Giovanni Arrighi, Immanuel Wallerstein, David Harvey, Mike Davis, etc., have developed in their respective fields innovative Marxist perspective. Marxism has also been able in recent years to take on new objects, for example, ecology, environmental issues. Thus, ecological Marxism, with authors like John Bellamy Foster, Paul Burkett, Ted Benton, James O'Connor, is one of the most creative areas of Marxism today. This capacity to adapt to the intellectual challenges of a new epoch is maybe the main criterion by which one can judge the vitality of an intellectual tradition, and I think it is quite obvious that Marxism has passed this test. However, and this is the important point, even if Marxism is analytically at its most interesting today, it has lost its hegemony over critical theories, the working class and social movements more generally. From the end of the 19th century to the 1980s, more or less, Marxism was the main language in which the experience of injustice was formulated, not only in the West, but in many other parts of the world. Marxism was not only a theory elaborated by and for intellectuals, it was an ideology for organizations and political regimes that included millions of people. Almost all of these organizations and regimes have now disappeared. Today, for the first time in their history, Marxists have become a minority in a wider set of critical theories where non-Marxist critical theories dominate. The dominant theoretical language in this wider set is certainly post-structuralism, the one that one can find, for instance, in postcolonial theory or cultural studies today. Now, a hypothesis one can make is that the current economic crisis, which is an organic crisis of the system as a whole, is going to change intellectual relations of force inside of critical theories, maybe. Marxism is a theory of crisis par excellence, whereas non-Marxist critical theories like post-structuralism or Jacques Rancière's philosophy or Axel Honneth's recognition theory have in fact very little to say about crisis. So, after a post-Marxist parenthesis, it is possible, in fact desirable in my opinion, that Marxism in a more classical form will make a comeback. To conclude, I would like to conclude to compare two forms of intellectual commitment that are separated by almost 50 years. During the Zuccotti Park occupation in New York in the autumn of 2011, acclaimed critical intellectuals, among them Slavoj Žižek, Judith Butler, and Cornel West, came to support the occupiers and to give speeches in front of them. You may be recalled that their speeches were aired through the so-called human microphone. A weird law in New York forbids the use of electric microphones in public space. So the only way for the speakers' voices to get through was for the front rows of the crowd to loudly repeat each of their sentences. And these speeches were then rapidly posted on YouTube. You may have seen some of these speeches. This, of course, is not the first time politically committed intellectuals have spoken in support of a movement of occupation. The Zuccotti Park scene recalls a famous speech given by French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre at the Renault automobile plant at Boulogne-Billancourt, near Paris, in 1970. A famous photograph shows Sartre perched on a cask, addressing the workers on strike and telling them that the alliance between intellectuals and the working class that once existed should be rebuilt. These were times of revolutionary upheaval in France and elsewhere, and intellectuals were urged to take sides. You can find this photograph this very famous photograph on the internet, if you like. Now, despite visual similarities, these two scenes, separated by almost 50 years, are in fact very different, profoundly different. First, Sartre spoke in front of automobile workers, that is, industrial workers, whereas Žižek, Butler, and West addressed a more indeterminate audience. The exact sociology of the Occupy movement and of recent global mobilization is still up for debate. A more middle-class recruitment than the workers' movement of the 19th and 20th century seems obvious. Secondly, Žižek, Butler, and West spoke not in front of an occupied factory, as Sartre did, but in a public place. The occupation of public places is a trademark of these new movements, not only the Occupy movement, but the Arab Spring as well, for instance. The difference with past movements is very important. Occupying public places is certainly a matter of reclaiming the street or of demanding a right to the city, as David Harvey would put it. But it is also a symptom of these movements not knowing what else to occupy. One occupies factories when one wants to speak to and organize the working class, when one thinks that the working class is a revolutionary class. But who do current movements want to organize when they occupy public places? Well, maybe the 99%, but this is obviously a very vague category. There is a third crucial difference between the two scenes. Sartre was never actually a member of a working class organization, but his political and intellectual universe was organized around their existence, and they structured the political field in which he spoke when he addressed the workers. Sartre was a fellow traveler, first of the French Communist Party, the PCF, and then of Maoist organizations. What about Žižek, Butler, and West? As I said before, today's critical intellectuals, no matter how politically committed and radical they may be, are free-floating and not organically linked to any kind of organization. When we try to understand what contemporary critical theories are, it seems to me, we need to make sense precisely of the differences between these two scenes. Jean-Paul Sartre in 1970 on the one hand, and Žižek, Butler, and West in the autumn of 2011 on the other. There obviously is no going back to Sartre's time. It is neither possible nor desirable. But with the ongoing crisis of capitalism, intellectual commitments, at once more connected to existing political and social organizations, and based on more precise maps of the existing social forces, of the revolutionary potential of different classes, are certainly required. Thank you.
Plenty of time now for Q&A, so let's throw the floor open. Ian,
the task you've taken on of mapping critical theory today is a prodigious one, and congratulations for taking on something quite so big. Let me just make two comments about the map. In the first place, with the notion about professors and so on, it's a fair observation. You say that therefore there is no relationship to praxis, I believe, and therefore move from there into the question of abstraction. Now, it would seem to me that all university professors do in fact have a praxis, and it's teaching. And that teaching occurs in an institution, and an enormous number of young people and people of all kinds really pass through that institution. So that requires an analysis. It's not a lack of praxis, it's a different praxis, for reasons, for sure, and all of those could be explored. But one of the consequences of that would seem to me to be the influence of universities and university-educated people on the arts and various other kinds of factors in things that are going on in society. And eventually the media, so that a lot of university-based critical categories have become fairly widespread in the society. So that's something that it seems to me you kind of ruled out, and I think that's pretty important actually. The second thing is, with regards to English as the language, the language of the Republic of Critical Theory that you talked about, you briefly mentioned that, but I think that's actually really also very important. And nobody becomes a major figure in this or cosmopolitan republic, or however you phrase it, global republic, without being published in English. So the politics of translation, indeed the economics of translation, things like, for example, the French Ministry of Culture's support for translations into English of French philosophers, has a lot to do with who becomes a big figure in this. So this also leads on to other questions about popularity. Who becomes popular, who therefore becomes a necessary reference. You know, you can't go to the toilet without hearing Slavoj Žižek. So, you know, all of that thing is a whole other dimension of this, which I think you passed over a bit too quickly.
Yeah, should we take a number of questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, maybe 3 at a time, and then you can answer. So we have here.
Well, my question actually goes in a very different direction. You kind of followed Perry Anderson's trajectory of the rise of Occidental Marxism and then its globalization/Americanization. But you made a few references to individuals like Ben Said, and I was wondering what you would say to the following question. Wasn't there a precursor to the globalization of critical thinking, and isn't there still a subterranean existence of it? And kind of the household names would be the Third International up to a point, possibly, then the Fourth International for sure, but also like the intergalactic meetings initiated by the Zapatistas, and then the World Social Forum, and with the, let's say, proletarianization of much of the academic workforce, maybe there is a chance of bringing the subterranean critical theories and the still, let's say, co-opted critical theories together again, and in the future it might be intellectuals from wherever they come from addressing academic workers instead of auto workers.
One more question in this round. Yeah, Andrew?
Yeah, I was going to add another aspect that perhaps is underemphasized, which is the 1960s. Because all those people were activists or were influenced by what happened in the 60s. So there's a historical event, just as in the end of World War I, there was a great offensive that produced a great flowering of theory, even though it failed politically. Similarly, after the 1960s failed, there was this flowering of theory. And I think that's important to articulate the development of theory in relation to these historical experiences, rather than simply in relation to phenomena like professionalization or Americanization.
Thank you for these questions. Should I speak in the microphone? I don't have answers to add a few comments. I agree fully with teaching as being a sort of practice, of course, but it's a specific kind of practice. And as we know in universities, at least in French universities that I know, the idea of politicizing the practice of teaching is resisted by authorities, really clearly. So as professors, we have to, at least in France, we have to teach programs that are determined in part by us, but in part also by the states or the Ministry of Education. And that makes the politicization of the practice of teaching not impossible, of course, but difficult. And moreover, the dominant strands of intellectual activity in France and elsewhere are not critical. They're neoliberal or they're other things. But so the question is, how would it be possible to politicize teaching as a political practice more than it is today? And the answer is by, in part, considering that teaching is a form of work, as other types of works. But this comes back to the question of how unions of intellectual workers are organized or not inside of the universities. And from my experience in France, the fact is that organizing in unions professors, university professors, has been very, very difficult and in fact impossible in recent years. So there is a form of absence of politics that exists in French universities at least, and I don't know how it is here, that is structurally embedded in the functioning of universities. So I have no solution to know how that could be transcended and be transformed into something different. Surely there has to be a form of opening of universities towards other types of practices, but clearly in France, at least, in the universities I know, this has not been possible in recent years. So some form of contradiction has to be brought inside of the university from the outside, it seems to me. But I can't see today what that could be, in a sense. I don't know if it's clear what I'm saying, but some form of alliance between social movements that exist outside universities has to be built with, say, teachers' unions or students' unions, and this hasn't happened until now. Of course, English as a dominant language, I didn't say it, but in the book I developed that point more fully, is of course impossible to be a dominant or known thinker without publishing in English, and this implies that publishing houses, have a very important role in deciding who is an important critical thinker and who is not, of course. And this is a problem, of course, because they make choices as everyone else, and these choices are in part political choices. So this is something we have to take account of, clearly. Now, is there, if I understood your question correctly, are there alternative forms of globalization or more ancient form of globalization in the intellectual and critical field that go back to the internationals, especially the third and fourth internationals? And you mentioned Daniel Ben Said. In fact, I was a member of Daniel Ben Said organization, and so I knew him well, and I consider him as someone very important. In fact, I think he's not enough translated into English. There's one or two books. Verso just published his autobiography, which is great if you want to have a look at it. But I think there's only 2 books of Daniel Ben Said that are translated to English, and that's too bad because he's a great thinker. And moreover, he was someone who traveled a lot, who traveled to Latin America. He knew very well Argentina, Brazil. He traveled to Africa, northern Africa. So he's clearly an example, like Mariátegui, not from the same generation, of course, but he's clearly an example of a traveling theorist, thinker, who brought with him categories, made travel categories from continents to continents. So clearly there are some forms of, earlier forms of globalization of critical thinking that were related to the international. That's clear. But it seems to me that today the dominant form of globalization is not that. It's globalization that is linked to universities, to the globalization of the global intellectual field and the academic field. So it doesn't mean that it will not change. Maybe it will change in the years to come. But today what is dominant is the fact that it's universities that globalize thinking and not political internationals. With regard to the question of historical experience and defeat, what is very interesting and very complex, it seems to me, is to understand where exactly theoretical innovation starts. Is it in contact with political experience, or is it the experience of defeat, when the social movements are defeated, that after a while theorists or thinkers start elaborating new ideas? And I suppose both cases exist. Some historical events go with their new forms of thinking. They are, as Gramsci would say, philosophical events. Gramsci said of the 1917 Russian Revolution that it was not only a political event, but a philosophical event. So he said that 1917 produced its own categories in a sense. But in other cases, it's not the event itself that produces new categories or theories. It is the defeat of the event. And it's maybe the case after 1968. It's clearly after the defeat of the 1848 movements that Marx started a new cycle of elaboration. So there's a link there between defeat and maybe innovation from a theoretical point of view. It seems to me the important point is that we certainly live today in a period of historical defeat. I'm sure everyone would agree. I don't see many victories from the point of view of that. Yet, it seems to me that today critical theories are very sophisticated and interesting, and I've named a few. So there's no direct causal link between a rise in social movements and a rise in critical innovation or theoretical innovation. We can have historically, and we have had historically, periods where social movements are down, are not in a good shape, and where nonetheless critical innovation inside of Marxism or psychoanalysis or say postcolonial theory or feminist theory has been very interesting and sophisticated. So the link is complex to establish. I wouldn't consider it as a direct causal link between experience and intellectual innovation.
So another round. Yes, here. Okay.
What would be a comparison? What kind of comparison would be between critical theories, between Peronism and Keucheyanism?
Yeah, my question is, where will you place in this map of critical thinking political movements like Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain, where academics are engaging in politics? Do you think they constitute kind of anecdotes or exception to the trends that you just described, or they could represent a shift in all these trends?
Good.
So just around related to your map, how you see the strain of French Maoism, where at least some within the bifurcations of that movement viewed the death of the political party as a site of emancipation, and that's partially where the distancing from the state comes from traditionally socialist or Marxist-oriented thinkers.
Peronism and Keucheyanism, that's a difficult question, and I'm not a specialist of Argentina. What I was saying is that Ernesto Laclau is a thinker that was very rapidly globalized in a sense, because he arrived in Great Britain at the end of the 50s or 60s. But on the other hand, he was always, in a sense, more or less distantly connected to the experiences of Argentina, and particularly with Peronism. Now, I would say that Keucheyanism, in a sense, Keucheyanism can't be understood without taking into account the continental situation. That is, the situation in Venezuela, the situation in Bolivia, the situation in Brazil, the situation in Chile. All of these progressive, so-called progressive governments were very different from one another. They all had specificities related to their countries. But on the other hand, this was clearly a continental movement. I don't know if you would agree, but I think there is something really continental from this point of view. And we can add that this continental dimension is clearly today in crisis, since most of these governments, with the exception maybe of Bolivia, are today in very, very big difficulties. For instance, in Argentina, the situation is obviously not very good lately. Whereas in my opinion, but here maybe I'm wrong, at the beginning Peronism was more strictly an Argentinian phenomenon, was linked to this strictly Argentinian social structure, historical experiences, the role of the army, which existed in other countries as well, but which maybe in the case of Juan Domingo Perón was more specific. So that's maybe an important difference. The fact that, of course, the Kirchners were no militaries. Perón himself was a military. That made a big difference, of course. Whereas in the case of the Kirchners, they were not from the army. Hugo Chavez was the military, which maybe makes for a comparison between him and Perón on that point of view. But I don't know, you should ask someone more specialized in the history of Argentina. In the case of Laclau, what interested him, seems to me, at the end of his life, and he passed away 3 years ago, was the fact that in his eyes, Kirchnerism was a kind of populist reason adapted to the conditions of Argentina. So it was a form of politics opposed to neoliberalism that was, according to him, a form of illustration of what he was saying in his last great book. Now, Syriza and Podemos, that's a great question. Syriza has been labeled as the government of academics. You may have read about that. A big part of these, there are two kinds of academics in Syriza, it seems to me. One type of academic is academics that were in Greek universities, and the second kind is academics that were internationalized, globalized, like Varoufakis himself used to teach in Austin, Texas, for instance. Kostas Apavitsas, who is a great economist, is a teacher at SOAS London. Well, there are many other academics that taught in international universities in England and the US, etc. Is this an exception to the rule I tried to elaborate, or does it confirm it? Well, maybe it's an exception. Maybe the coming to power of Syriza is the start of a new cycle of interaction, of interplay between theory and practice. This is maybe the case. It is too soon to tell, in a sense. And the same goes for Podemos. But it seems to me that the specificity of this situation is that these intellectuals were teachers, academics, and they connected with social movements in not all cases, but in some cases, relatively lately in their trajectory. For instance, Varoufakis is not even now a member of Syriza. I think, I don't know if maybe he has become a member recently, but historically he wasn't a member of Syriza. Kostas Apavitsas, the economist that we're talking about, I don't think he's a member of Syriza. So there's a connection that is established at a recent time when Syriza, maybe 2 years ago when Syriza went up in the polls, but they from the sociological point of view, they remain academics, it seems to me. So they don't have the type of connection that existed between theory and practice at the time of the classical Marxists. But I would say that this is maybe the start of something different, possibly. Well, the situation has not been good for Syriza in the past few weeks, as you know, of course, to say the least. So maybe it's not the start of something new. I don't know. We'll see. It's too soon to tell. Now, about Maoism and French Maoism, the question was the link with the question of the party, the political party. Is that it? Yes, for Badiou or Rancière, the type of theoretical elaboration they have made in the past decades is elaboration that are very critical of French and international communist movement, party movements, and which are also very critical of their own experience as Maoists in the 60s and 70s. Both were members, Badiou and Rancière, of different types of Maoist organizations. And the conclusion they come to, both of them, through different roads, is that the political party belongs to an era of politics, of political cycles that is now finished, in a sense. So to them, a form of political spontaneism, does it exist?
Yeah.
Spontaneism, which is thought of differently for Rancière and Badiou, seems to be the kind of solution they come to. And this is what leads Alain Badiou to his famous theory of the event. Now, Daniel Ben Said, I was talking about Daniel Ben Said earlier. Daniel Ben Said has written a great text about Badiou entitled The Miracle of the Event, and where Daniel, which was a member of a political party until his death in 2010, said that when one forgets the importance of political parties and organizations in politics, well, the only alternative is spontaneism, and this leads to a form of theology, in a sense, a form of belief in the fact that events will happen no matter what, and that when these events happen, well, politics will start again. But the thing is, Daniel said, that when that happens and that the left is not ready, not organizing political parties and unions and other types of political forms, well, the event will start and it will stop and nothing will happen, in a sense. So I think that that article of Daniel's is translated to English. It's a very sharp critique of Badiou and also of Rancière. And Daniel wasn't, he thought, of course, political organizations had to evolve. He wasn't advocating a kind of return to Lenin or to Gramsci even. He thought that political parties should clearly adapt to the current conjuncture. But at the same time, they would remain political parties and not something else. So for him, political parties are a condition of politics, in a sense.
So I have a question, Hilda Fernandez, then also has a question, and then we have a third question here, and then the next round. Okay. My question has to do with your reliance on Perry Anderson's approach to Western Marxism in Tracts of Historical Materialism and Considerations on Western Marxism, which has been quite highly contested. I'm wondering if you were to have drawn in somebody like Russell Jacoby. He's actually been somebody who's been quite associated with the Institute over the years. You might be able to draw some somewhat different conclusions. First of all, I think in terms of the question of empirical research, to say that the Institute for Social Research really did try to develop an interdisciplinary, empirically oriented, theoretically informed research program, right? As a way of understanding the conditions of defeat, right? And the rise of fascism. One can point to the authoritarian personality, right? As an example of an attempt, maybe not an entirely successful one, but I think quite a significant attempt to carry through this research program. Russell Jacoby is also somebody who, like you, wants to do a kind of sociology of intellectuals and intellectual activity. And so in the last Intellectuals, he talks about the hollowing out of these relatively independent spaces for intellectual work, right? In ways that remind one a little bit of Habermas's public sphere book, right? That the public sphere emerges in these coffee houses in Europe in the late 18th century, which in some ways seems a little quaint to us today, but there is a sense of a different sort of space in which intellectual activity can take place, which has really been hollowed out by neoliberalism. Then there's a movement into the academy, specialization, professionalization, Americanization. So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
So my question is a little bit whether or not there was an implicit proposal about the efficacy of the approach being the Marxism between the connection between the theory and the practice more efficient or more successful, which then later you said, well, has failed, right? Versus the post-structuralism, right? That's one question. But a reflection that I got to think right now is whether or not the structural theory of post-structuralism being about fragmentation might be playing this free-floating, not relational, horizontal kind of encounter within this theory and practice. And I was just thinking, I'm a Mexican living here in Canada, and thinking about Ayotzinapa and all this horrendous situation that is going on with the narco state in Mexico, and how, whether or not theory is absolutely necessary for a movement, whereas right now it's happening that people are organizing in the social population by means of an ethical stand against this horrendous taking over the government. I wonder if theory is absolutely necessary. So that would be the question.
And then the third question.
Hi. I just want to comment one in the situation of this critical thinkers teaching. I think that in the industrialization point, the only thing that is remarkable or worth to remark is that what it creates is just a balance point of being comfortable. You have there created a group of people that work enough to be in that point of equilibrium to produce something to be published, but not uncomfortable enough or worried enough to produce something really meaningful. You know, there are works that will be worthless here to 50 years. You know, it's not about the profession of teaching. I think that it's more about this point of equilibrium that is creating this mass of people that lives in that point. You know, too comfortable and maybe not too worried. I appreciate, I was very amazed by this lecture. I was expecting a much more unconnectable level of understanding, and I map a lot the thinkers, and I map a lot everybody who has created some sort of meaning to understand what was the way or what was the what were they thinking at that moment, from where they come from, and what was the political moment. So I think it's a very landed way to understand these people. Especially because things are changing right now a lot. I want to make, that was my first comment. My second comment is about that globalization, yes, make us all to have to know English. I have to go through that. It was really painful. It was pretty terrible. But it also gives us, there's a certain level of anarchism within the way we communicate with each other. We have the Iranian government funding by SpanTV, Podemos, their program, which Iglesias uses to communicate his ideas. The Greece government, the left, which has been elected, has used this anarchic force for now to communicate to the German government about what is their position about the debt and the cutting of the funds. So I think that it's a little bit negative the way we talk about globalization, where we can also play within this new level of anarchy with these new worlds, right? Because I don't know, the girl that commented before me is a Mexican that worries about Mexico, but she's here. But you can be, you know, there is no way anymore to be just in one place. Because it's not that I sent a letter and it takes 3 months to arrive to my home in South America anymore. So there is a lot of changing in the way we can impact, and yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you for these questions. Should I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Russell Jacobi, I know his work, of course, but for some reason, Perry Anderson's approach was more productive for me. I mean, I'm not saying there's no criticism to be made of Perry Anderson, of course. I think there's clearly a way in which Perry Anderson idealizes classical Marxism. Saying that the connection between theory and practice is obviously in the case of classical Marxism is debatable. I mean, in each case, it is clear that the case of Gramsci is not the same as the case of Trotsky, which is not the same case as Kautsky, etc. One should be much more precise as to the way theory and practice are connected in each national working class movement, each thinker, etc. So there's many criticisms to be made to Perry Anderson, but to me it was very useful to understand this question of the link between theory and practice. And this was, again, to come back to Daniel Ben Said, I don't know why I'm talking about him so much, it's useful, I think. Daniel was maybe one of the last classical Marxists in the sense that he was always a member of a party and he also wrote books. So what I wanted to understand in a sense is why in his case something was remaining possible, the connection between theory and practice, and in many other cases, cases of Badiou, Rancière, or Zizek, or others, well, there was a clear dissociation, a distinction between theory and practice. And it seemed to me that Per Anderson was more useful to understand that. So it was really something practical in the sense of it was linked with this project of this book. But I'm not saying, of course, that there's no criticism to be made to Per Anderson's approach. There's a great text, I don't know if it's translated into English, but Stathis Kouvelakis, who is one of the intellectuals of the left platform of Syriza, you may have heard about him. He published a great interview on Jacobin magazine a month ago about Syriza. He wrote a very important criticism of Per Anderson's approach in French. So I'll send it to you maybe. I'll ask him if it's translated or not, but there's a very, very sharp criticism of Per Anderson. The question of, is theory necessary? There are, of course, many movements where theory exists, but not maybe in a very formalized way, and that's absolutely fine. Of course, movements can exist without theory. But I think, and from this point of view, I remain a Leninist in a sense, I think what the function of theory is connecting struggles. It's making a connection between one struggle at one place, say in Mexico, and another struggle, say in France, or in Australia, or Canada, etc. In other words, it's a function of totalizing different types of struggles, of experiences, and to totalize you need theory. I think that's the main purpose of theory. So various kinds of movements can exist, but for them to become one movement and to have a global impact on a country, for example, or on many countries at a continental level, say, for instance, Europe, well, something like a theory is needed, something like a theory that connects theory and practice, and that also gives some strategic perspectives, it seems to me. This is really the main function of theory. So ethical stances are, of course, absolutely needed, and all good theory contains also ethical models, of course, implicit or explicit, obviously. But to totalize, to represent a global situation, or at least a national situation, or a continental situation, one needs theory. So that's, it seems to me, the main argument in favor of theory, and the main argument in favor of, being interested in such matters, and not only in a day-to-day struggle, in a sense, considering that the two should be connected. One aspect about the question of violence, it seems to me that there are very interesting theories of violence in contemporary theories, and I think in the book I don't talk about them enough from the perspective of theories of violence. And in France, of course, we have Etienne Balibar, which is a great post-Althusserian philosopher who has written many very interesting things about violence. Not so much about the situation in Mexico, but I'm sure there are people in Mexico that are, inspired by his ideas, and he's someone very, very interesting. And there are other perspectives, like the one of Giorgio Agamben, state of exception and all that. So I think that is something that is going to be, because the violence of the system in the context of the crisis will necessarily increase. Theories of violence will also be more and more interesting and sophisticated in a sense, I suppose. The question of anarchy and the anarchy in the system, I fully agree that there exists anarchy in the system, and that progressive movements, revolutionary movements, social movements can make use of anarchy. But anarchy doesn't mean that there aren't hegemonic powers. I mean, the Greek government can make use of whatever it wants. When it goes to Berlin, Wolfgang Schäuble, which is the Minister of Finance, says no, you're not going to not pay your debt. And this is not a question of anarchy, this is a question of hegemony inside of the European, you know. So I think there are spaces of liberty, spaces of autonomy that exist in Greek society, for instance, as much as in France and Canada and everywhere else. But I think the recognition that there exists anarchy, or multitudes in the sense of Tony Navy, shouldn't make us forget the fact that interstate relations exist, hegemony exists, international relations exist, social classes exist that are structured in national formation and international formation. And that, well, to make real differences politically, in a sense, it appears that one has to engage in good old-fashioned politics, in the sense that the Greeks have.
Yeah,
They participate in elections, eventually they get elected, and then the problems start. It's the politics, in a sense. So I would recognize the existence of networks, anarchy, etc. But the question is how to connect the two of them. This is very difficult. I think we don't have today a satisfactory theory of, there's many criticism to be made to Tony Negri's notion of multitude, of anarchy, etc. But on the other side, it is quite obvious that he captures something real that exists at the international level as well as the national level. So we should work on trying to connect older versions of politics with new types of elaborations about networks and multitudes.
Right. One last round. Oh, that's right, you did. One question.
My question got partly answered by what you just said, but if I could still go ahead with it, is that are Butler and company addressing the wrong audience? Or is that the only audience available to them and they have to make do with that indeterminate mass? And is the problem of critical theory today that it's unable to really theorize, conceptualize as to what to do with this indeterminate mass? This is the only reality. And is it that there is a structural limitation in this indeterminate mass that they will, unlike the working class, they will have a stake within the existing system?
So I'm starting thinking, if all the critical thinkers are in academia, do you think it's in the education systems and in the education problem, and any way we can identify consequences or praxis from the thinkers to the actual systems? And maybe I'm thinking maybe student movements and maybe schooling as praxis. I don't know. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I was trying to think through what you were talking about earlier with, Barry Anderson's critique of Western Marxism as this sort of theory of defeat from these sort of declassed intellectuals. And I was wondering if it would be possible to maybe go a bit further and think about the role of publishing houses and the universities in deciding who gets to become part of critical theory. Because the people you mentioned, like Spivak, Zizek, etc., and then with some exceptions now, Daniel Ben-Said for English, it's pretty recent, but you have to hunt quite hard to get at his works on strategy, whereas his works on high theory are relatively easily available. And then, Spivak is available easily, but black feminist Marxism is much less sort of like integrated into critical theory, right? Like, sort of similarly, like the Trotskyists on Fourth International, Hal Draper, the neo-Trotskyists in the UK, sort of much less integrated. And I'm wondering, well, like, is that a fair critique? Am I maybe just missing something? Like, why has it developed in that way?
And,
like, is university the death for Marxism?
That's really interesting.
So we'll take forward the time.
Thanks. Just in terms of the parsing of praxis versus the analytic, the production of how labor is divided within the university, I think this is really interesting. But I'm just curious to know it's almost as if you're pitching the kinds of labor and the kinds of activity that happen within the space of theorization that focuses on analytical approaches, whether the development of metaphors and concepts. I'm just wondering if you're just pushing that a bit into a space that sort of presents the university as an ivory tower. And given that, what I worry about there is that true? Is there such a thing as a kind of a redundant analytical, in the production of concepts and analysis, is it as redundant as I'm understanding you to be suggesting, is it not the case that that becomes part of a vocabulary that precipitates, that the boundary between the university and the general kind of public, if you like, if we pitch it like that, that's a bit more porous, perhaps, and concepts seep out, and they're also informed empirically as well. And surely that's what the humanities does. It is the interface of just that. There's the porosity and the space, the kind of space of reflection that's permitted within the university, in essence, works empirically. It's at the forefront of producing concepts.
Difficult questions. I will try to say a few words, but I don't have answers to. The best strategic thinking today, in my opinion, in Europe, comes out of two countries, Greece and Spain. In other words, it is in the countries where social movements and new political parties are emerging that the interesting concepts, notions, strategies are elaborated by these social movements, the Dignados, Podemos, or Syriza in Greece, and not in other countries. Of course, there are strategic ideas interesting in other countries too, but clearly there's something going on in Greece and Spain, seems to me very obvious. And this, it seems to me, answers in part your question, which is that without political movements, social movements, well, thinking becomes a form of activity of its own without connection with, you know. So the question is not really if Butler is addressing the wrong audience, or I think there are structural conditions in which ideas, thinkers become connected in mysterious ways with social and political movements. And there are other conditions where this connection is not possible. And this is not a question of an individual having a voluntaristic stance, trying to elaborate strategic concepts in abstract or in a sense. So social and political conditions are required, in a sense, to make the connection between theory and practice visible. And again, in the past few years, in Europe at least, in Greece and Spain, something very important has happened. I mean, the Syriza experience might well end up in a disaster. That's of course possible. But even if it's the case, in a sense, it has already been productive politically and theoretically. That is, it has asked questions to the Europeans. It has explored some strategic hypotheses. The fact that Syriza came to power by electoral means, for instance, is very surprising. I mean, the old theory is that radical governments don't come to power through elections. So this is already something interesting to think about, in a sense, even if it's a failure in the end. You see? So these questions, which are strategic questions, are put in certain contexts and not in other contexts. And this is, in my opinion, not a question of thinkers trying to answer this question by themselves in their offices or etc. The question of student movements. There is a very interesting movement in the US, which is the movement, I don't know if it exists in Canada, debt strike. The idea that students will not repay their debt. And that exists also in Great Britain. So this is a very interesting question because it brings together the question of debt repayment and the question of the condition of the student, in a sense, the fact that students are more and more, even in France today. France had a system, a very public system that didn't make students take loans to study, but that now is becoming more and more close to the Anglo-American system. So it seems to me that in the connection between these two problematics, political problematics, there is the question of debt and the question of studying, etc. Something very interesting is going to come up. And maybe in a few years, if we have a discussion of this kind, maybe it will have become something central, in a sense, in our strategic thinking. The question about why are certain, if I understood you well, why are certain thinkers famous, others not, or less famous? What was that, the question? What is the reason of the success of people like Slavoj Žižek or Spivak, or as opposed to, say, Ben Segment? etc.
And the particular texts of Benzi that are chosen for translation, I think, are also not accidental.
You mean the text on Marx and the autobiographical text?
Yeah.
Yeah, versus the more personal text.
Directly strategy type question. Stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't really know. I mean, I know well the person who made the efforts to translate and that chose the text, and maybe it's a text more accessible to an English audience. I don't know. I mean, many texts of Daniel's are deeply connected to the French situation and would require, of course, a contextualization. That is the fact that it's not necessarily easily available to audiences in other countries. But there are many texts, for example, his book about Walter Benjamin or his book about Joan of Arc, which are wonderful texts and that could be translated into English very, very easily without the context being a very, very difficult obstacle. So I don't know. There is, I don't know, Daniel is, maybe he was too busy being involved in politics and not enough busy, traveling in universities and all that, and that's maybe one of the reasons that happened. But of course there are other aspects of the question. The fact that Daniel, let's say, remained a Marxist in a fairly classical sense, of course, in a period historically, the 1980s and 1990s, where post-structuralism was more à la mode, as we say in France, it was more prominent, of course, was also a reason, the fact that Marxism was in decline in the 80s and 90s, and then Daniel remained a Marxist in a sense, rendered his books less interesting maybe for an Anglo-American audience. I don't know, it's a difficult question. I'm not really sure to have an answer to that question. And the question of the more or less open situation of universities in relation to society, if I understood you correctly. I think the question of the circulation or diffusion of categories or concepts outside of universities is certainly the case, but it's the case differently according to the country we find ourselves in. Now, when I finished my PhD, I went to Argentina for 6 months to do a postdoc. And what was very fascinating at the Universidad de Buenos Aires was the fact that politics was everywhere. Maybe some of you have been to Buenos Aires, to the university. There was really a connection, a deep connection between the society, or some parts of society in Buenos Aires, and the universities, in the sense that, for instance, people that were not students came, for instance, to listen to not only conferences, but organized assemblies. And the university is much more open towards society than in other cases. For instance, in France today, universities are very closed on themselves, in the sense that the circulation of categories, of concepts, of experiences is very difficult today in French universities. I'm sure around May 68 and the years that followed, the situation was much different. But one of the consequences of neoliberalism has been to close universities on themselves, to make students, university students, much more interested in their own trajectory in studies, as opposed to open to other experiences, dialogue with other parts of society, etc. So this is really something we have to think about in different national contexts, it seems to me, and to think about as well with a historical dimension, in the sense that the tendency has been for universities, and I don't know how it is here, but in France, it's obvious, it seems to me, that in the past 15 years, 20 years, universities have become more and more closed, not dialoguing with other parts of society.
It's interesting that the articulation of neoliberalism comes out of a university, comes out of Chicago primarily. And I think it's interesting that how that sort of lit up, or how it was implemented through the practices of the World Bank, etc., and the implementation of it, I think is another kind of question. It still doesn't deny, or at least it's still, you know, we're probably mostly thinking about forms of resistance, and it still seems to me perfectly available to us as people who are here embodying the university to recognize that we are in that position of being able to produce, if you like, the armor too, even though, as you say, one ideological or economic kind of doctrine has precipitated and become dominant. It seems to me we're in this interesting moment where the production.
Yes, the thing we don't have is the connection with powerful institutions like the World Bank, of course, or others. I mean, in the case of neoliberalism, there was groups of intellectuals, small groups at the beginning, Société du Montpellier and others, and what they found after the crisis of Keynesianism was a way to connect with governments, with international institutions. And what we don't have as a left, as critical thinkers, etc., is this first step that would connect us with institutions that could, in a sense, have an influence more general and more powerful on various sections of society. What could have started in Greece is this connection with state apparatuses, in a sense, connection between ideas, transformational ideas, and we'll see what happens in the weeks and months to come. So this is a very important connection.
If I could also just make a quick remark to this point, and also a very interesting point about how contradictions that are external to the university should, in a sense, be manifested, invited in, as it were, to the university. And I think in some ways that's what we're trying to do, especially with this conference, because we have a number of academics, for sure, but there are also other intellectuals who are not tied necessarily to the academy. And of course, there are a lot of grassroots land defenders from various First Nations communities who are coming to speak, to put on workshops, and so on. And that's in a way fulfilling the mission of this institute, which is to create that porosity, between the larger public sphere and the university. And there's a bit of a contradictory space. So.
Something very depressing is that in French universities, a conference like that one would be impossible today. In my university, for example, introducing political themes, political discussions is quasi-impossible. It's very difficult. Of course, it would be different in the 1970s and 80s. Obviously, in France, universities were very political. But today, one of the evolutions of French universities, and I think this is the case in many universities throughout Europe, is the fact that politics is kept out of universities, and activists of different kinds cannot enter university even physically.
This is a kind of Sarkozy effect, right?
Yeah, sure. And even before Sarkozy, Sarkozy of course has made this worse.
Yeah.
So this is something we have to work on.
All right, yes.
The question is almost following up on the public sphere comments, following out of public spheres, and particularly around technology. I'm thinking especially of how hegemonic as a neoliberal institute like Facebook is, or Google or someone, is in the way we communicate and the way we also organize and mobilize. And it's, these tools are commonly considered as just benign tools, which is not obviously the case. And to what extent do you think this can be, is there an insufficiency of sophisticated theory with respect to technology that kind of leaves it out? Or how can we move towards a liberation of social sphere by connecting theories to technology, social theories to technology?
You've got the expert right here under your feet.
We should
It's not my show.
So we can just go one at a time.
Yeah. Well, so at least in the book, there's no part devoted to technology, and this is maybe Maybe something very wrong there. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Of course, it exists. But maybe in the new edition of the book, I will add something. So yes, I don't know. This is something. This is obviously something we have to think about in relationship, of course, to social movements. The Arab Spring is said to have been in part made by Facebook, etc. Of course, we have to be very critical about this. But I'm not. I don't know enough about the Arab Spring to have something like that happen in part, at least, or not. So I don't know. I don't really know how to answer your question. There are theories of technology, of course. Donna Haraway, of course, Latour, and others. But in the cases I know of it, these are general theories of technology, and maybe not on the practice side of how day-to-day practice of these technologies or political practice in relationship to these new technologies can bring change in the way social movements and revolutionary movements will happen in the future. So this is something I still have to work on.
Are there any final questions? Okay, well, in that case, I mean, we have made Razmig very hard in the question period. So I think it would be good now to bring it to a close. I'd like to thank him again for